So if I can have your attention, please. I'd like to ask everyone, while we have just a few more people that are signing up for the ARE, and we're going to give them a couple of minutes to complete that sign up. In the 1930s, Edgar Cayce gave a series of very prolific prophecies. One of these prophecies is regarding the Soviet Union, the Russian Republic. Edgar Cayce said, "From Russia comes hope for the world." That's very thought-provoking. It is a powerful time. And it seems that in this present phase of what I call year 6 of the new earth, there is a positioning that might fit prophecies of both Cayce and Nostradamus regarding the United States and Russia. And so I want to open this panel discussion with William Henry, John Hogue, Dr. Lora, and John Van Auken regarding their insights, their feelings, their personal interpretations. And we're going to ask each one at a time just to take a few minutes, and then after that we'll let it flow into spontaneous conversation. I'd like to start with John Van Auken and just take a few moments to share with us your interpretation of that prophecy, please.
Okay. I would like to tie that prophecy in with the China prophecy. Edgar said, "Out of Russia comes the hope of the world, and in the future, China will be the cradle of Christianity as applied in people's lives." Be very careful with him. He's very specific. That was not the church. The spirit of Christianity as applied in people's lives. What is that spirit? It's love God with all your being and love one another. And so that's the spirit. It's a communal spirit of the fatherhood, motherhood of the Creator, and the brotherhood, sisterhood of all the children of God. So that's the spirit, he says, is gradually going to grow. Now, honestly, most of us, or many of us at ARE, thought Gorbachev and perestroika, which could be translated as restructuring, some word like restructuring, and glasnost would be something akin to openness, and that he started to fulfill this expectation that Cayce was putting out, and perhaps Mother Mary also meant at Fatima in 1917, October 13th, when she said, "Pray for the souls of Russia." And of course, on the 17th of that month, the Bolshevik Revolution shut down the church. But it's open again, it's back. I think we take 2 or 3 steps forward, and then the dark forces or the weaker nature of humanity takes a step back. In China, I remember when Deng Xiaoping came out and wanted to reform China, and mostly he focused on economy and let all the peasants take a portion of their produce and sell it in free open markets. That is not communism. That was very interesting. And that really changed the people. And I've been over in China a lot recently and working with the people over there. We have a nice center in Shanghai. And there is a growing life spirit in those people from that. Now, Xiaoping never gave up central law and power. I don't want to mislead you. And President Xi apparently is making that even firmer by becoming president for life. So some of these things, take 2 or 3 steps forward and then 1 or 2 back. I don't know that it's going to happen miraculously, but as you can see, there have been efforts to bring hope to the world, and the cradle of Christianity as applied in people's lives. So I feel good about that, and it seemed to me that Our Lady of Fatima was very aware of the potential with the people of Russia and very concerned about it. And so I think there's a collective consciousness moving that way, but it's got a lot of struggles to go through before it's fully manifested. That would be my perspective.
Thank you. Dr. Lora?
Okay, when you read Casey's reading about prophecies for Russia and lots of other nations, one of the things that just jumped right out at me was the statement, and he repeats it more than once, that we are our brother's keeper. And what he was trying to say, I think, about Russia, because he makes real clear that it's not about communism, it's not about even the Bolshevik Revolution, but it's about a change of consciousness that apparently he feels that Russia was the beginning of, that at least planted the seed of. And if you've read very much about, for example, in Europe, the monarchies and what happened after the Bolshevik Revolution, most of the monarchies that we see now are kind of hanging on by their fingernails because a lot of them were overturned during that period. Well, the reason was that there were people at the highest level who had all of the money, all of the advantage, and there were lots of people at the lower level who were suffering. There was a real divide between the haves and the have-nots. And the have-nots finally organized enough to do the revolution. But then as John points out, oftentimes when we make a change, and we do this individually, we go a little too far. And sometimes we don't find that sweet spot. I think of it like the old radios where we used to have to turn the dial. And sometimes if you were driving down the road and you were trying to find just a perfect radio station, you had to really keep going back and forth to finally find that spot where wherever you were, the aerial was going to pick it up. And I think that's sort of how all of this works. But I think Casey was pointing out that Russia had the right idea, that to some extent socialism has the right idea, but they still hadn't applied it yet. And it's not so much even that socialism is the correct thing, but it's that it comes back to that statement he made, we are our brother's keepers. Doesn't mean we take care of our brother and we enable our brother to be all our brother can be, but that we do what we can do to help our brother be his ideal, fulfill his mission, his soul mission in life, and be the support for each other. We're there for each other. I feel it here. I have felt it this weekend here among all of you. You manifest that. And I think that's what is the hope of the world, and that's what he was seeing in that moment in Russia.
Thank you. And before we pass it over to John Hogue, and please correct me if I misquote this, but didn't Casey also say something, and this is to John and Lora, that if the United States did not find a way to take care of its fellow man, that the power of the domination power would shift to China?
He said it would shift west, right, John?
Culture will continue to move westward.
John?
When looking at prophecy, I think it's important to always check your premises, to always check the national or religious filters that you view other nations with. I know a lot of Russians. When I just did 3 documentaries in the early part of this year where over 100 million Russians saw me talking about Edgar Casey's prophecies. And the Russians, they speak to me. I think it's important for Americans, especially because of the other thing that Casey alerted us to, is the danger of Americans not practicing what they preach. And Casey was very hard on the United States in that Russian and reading of nations. And certainly when he talks about moving westward, when you move westward, you're moving to China. You're moving to the Asian Rim. You're also moving to that country which is the only country that straddles east and west. You're moving to Russia. There has been a move from Europe for 500 years to America, and now it continues westward back full circle to Asia. And whether we in our national identity like it or not, the future is a Chinese century. It is realities of trends must be embraced. About one step forward, 2 steps back. And about monarchies showing a sign of when they're about to collapse. I would lovingly caution all of you that the separation of wealth in this country indicates that this country is also a regime, a monarchy, an empire that is about to undergo a collapse of that hegemonic point of view. Other great nations like China, Germany, Russia have experienced this. The other thing, too, is that the way in which, as I said in the lecture, I would say, again, that where Gorbachev started it, the way Russians feel about the true end of the collapse of the time of troubles that happened after the Russian Federation arose out of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian people view Vladimir Putin as somewhat of like a new Peter the Great, a new reformer. He is very much loved there, and I'll say again, in this country, with its national filters, he is very, very much misunderstood. And if you look in the mirror of magic of prophecy without checking your premises, you might really miss what Edgar Casey really meant.
I don't have more to add about Casey's prophecy, but recently, Ancient Aliens, we did an episode on Russian cosmism. This was an episode that I suggested as one of the co-producers of the show and a writer on the show. It was a movement that was started before the Bolshevik Revolution, started by a guy named Tsiolkovsky. He was a physicist, a mathematician, who was in contact with light beings that gave him an equation for the design of rockets that ultimately put Sputnik into Earth's orbit. And he had this vision of the hope for humankind was that we would migrate into space. And since Putin's been in office in Russia, Russian cosmism has come back into vogue. There's all kinds of conferences talking about it, the development of the new and perfected human. They're reaching back into Russian history and recognizing that during the Essene diaspora of 70 AD, that there were Essenes that came into Russia and planted ideas and information that the Russian cosmists are drawing upon. So most Americans have no idea who Tsiolkovsky was. If you ask a NASA scientist, they certainly know who he was. They certainly don't know who Fedorov was, who was the prophet that preceded Tsiolkovsky, and this idea of humans migrating into space with Russia leading us into space. And part of this is an acceptance of AI and transhumanism, because the Russians, like the Chinese, are well aware and very comfortable with the idea that we need to turn ourselves into robots in order to go into space. And of course, in Russia and in China, you don't have the ethical and moral implications or discussions like we do in this country. We've got some brakes on in terms of the ethics of genetic development and so forth. That doesn't exist in China, where they're very comfortable with taking human DNA and starting to tweak it. They're very comfortable with integrating Chinese society with robots. And so when we talk about culture shifting west and taking over the world, so to speak, it's going to be a technological-based culture. It's going to be one based on the idea that humanity is preparing to migrate into space. Now, there is a spiritual component to this because Russian cosmism has as its foundation the idea that the reason we want to migrate into space is to resurrect all of the dead all throughout the universe. It believes in the existence of a multiplicity of worlds, plurality of worlds, where there's inhabited civilizations spread throughout the cosmos, of which we're a part. And the Russian vision, the new Russian vision, Russian cosmism, is to move into space so that we can go out into all these other star systems and resurrect all of the dead. So in this case, Russian cosmism says we are the saviors of the universe. And this is what is motivating a lot of contemporary Russian thinking, even from Vladimir Putin, who is very well versed. Throughout the rise of transhumanism and artificial intelligence in the past 8 years, you haven't had a single American president utter the words artificial intelligence, even though they called the Obama administration the Android administration because Google set up shop in the White House. Okay? Donald Trump has slowed down the rise of globalism and transhumanism with his nationalism. Make America Great Again is all about rejecting the globalist vision of no borders, no sexes, no culture, no religion, no spirituality. You're only an earthling. And this is what we see coming now out of China especially, and even out of Russia as well, is this idea. Vladimir Putin has publicly stated very well, whoever wins the AI race, and it's a US, China, and Russia, will rule the world. Make no mistake about it, Russia intends to rule the world. And they tell us that the U.S. is leading this race, but China is so adept at copying and stealing our technology, and again, without any ethical or moral constraints on it whatsoever, that they are also a good bet for superseding our power and taking over the world with AI. So I've got a couple articles about this on my website, williamhenry.net. Homo Cosmicus is one which goes into Russian cosmism, and then I have other articles about the rise of China and its use of AI and genetics.
Thank you very much. Now, a few years ago, I was reading a book by Hugh Lynn Casey, Charles Thomas's father, and he mentions that his father used to teach classes and that his father, Edgar, would occasionally see disincarnate souls from the other side and energies, spiritual energies, listening to his lectures. And he mentioned that Cassius, and he said it this way, and this was from Hugh Lynn's, the character Cassius from the play by Shakespeare attended one of the lectures. So my question is this: was he referring to the historical Cassius, or is it possible that when we consider that Casey also said thought forms are living things, that when we read a book or have a certain belief, do we energize a character into a living thought form? And I'd like to address this first to John Hogue.
Hello. Cosmos calling. When I was a member of the Osho commune in Oregon, probably many of you saw in the wild, wild country, at least an outsider's view, not an insider's view like mine, one of my roles was to be the ranch exorcist. Or I worked in Rajni security, and when I was a rover, doing my tour as rover, I'd drive into the main police center, and they'd say, "We've got one of those reports for you to look at." And I said, "You're going to write it down for the record for the Oregon State Police, aren't you?" "You know we can't do that." There was a disc that landed by Moses Grove, and some people living out there saw it. "Could you go check that out?" We had a lot of woo-woo going on around the 64,000 acres of that ranch. And I had an experience there also with a lot of hauntings and ghosts. And to make the story short, in Antelope, we had our school there and near to the ranch, and there was an old lady who was floating around. in the rafters of the stage. And the cleaners didn't want to go there and clean at night anymore. So I went out there to see it and check it out. And definitely there was an old lady floating around. And but I had this intuition that was rather radical from the things I always like to try to do is whatever I've been taught by society is the way right side up is, I always know it's upside down. And so I thought, all right, what if actually ghosts are, that in hauntings, are not actually ghost spirits that are trapped? Not always, but not usually all the time. And maybe they're like radiation. Maybe thought and emotions that are thrown off of a person, especially in a negative situation, because most ghosts seem to be unrequited in their problems, and it's thrown off into the household region for living people to kind of step in and through their subconscious and act and engage those images and thoughts. So I tested it out. Rather than worrying or trying to conjure the ghost that was up there or do the usual exorcism things, I talked to the people and did work on the people who were cleaning that area. And I worked with them to not feed their fear into this. And the ghost disappeared. The ghost didn't appear again until a new crew of cleaners came there to clean, and then Granny was there again. So about this idea of a thought form, thoughts forms are things in the apparent dualistic world. The thing that I would contend that experiences them as it experiences another kind of ghost we don't usually think of a ghost haunting us in our skulls is our programmed personalities and our identification with our egos. The word idiot was used by Gurdjieff. He called his disciples idiots, but he didn't mean it in the derogatory way that most of us consider that term. It means in ancient mystical Greek, idios means one who is separate under the illusion of being separate from the cosmos. And so in this way, we're also haunted by our thoughts. And in this way, too, one can also kind of getting the distance and those thoughts can then evaporate. So, yes, it is possible, I would say.
Thank you. So you're saying there is a Santa Claus?
Yes. No.
Thank you. No, it is a fascinating question. And so I'd like to direct this question to Lora and John. Edgar Cayce, of course, was a highly advanced soul. And it is considered that he had lifetimes as a very high-ranking priest in Egypt. Is Pythagoras. And obviously very, very high levels of advancement. According to the readings, the lifetime Cayce had just before he incarnated in the late 19th century as Edgar Cayce, he was had a couple of lifetimes as a man named Bainbridge, who was a bit of a gambler, womanizer, and rogue. And so the question comes to mind, when we reincarnate, is it possible that time on the other side is not linear, and that the progression of our lifetimes does not necessarily follow chronological time? Could it be that an earlier lifetime of Cayce, before he achieved certain spiritual heights, was in the 19th century as Bainbridge, and so that his progressions followed perhaps threads of life purposes rather than linear time? Do you think that all lifetimes are in sequence, or on the other side, can we pick out an era that we want to go into? And so I'm going to go with John Van Auken, and then we'll come down. I'd like all of you to comment on that. We'll go John, Lora, John, William.
At the fullest level of truth, and John Hogue was touching on it. As much as we live in a manyness reality, there is only a oneness. And in one of Casey's readings, he said the first lesson should be one. One, one, one. And then he yelled it. And Gladys, his stenographer, whenever he raised his voice, she would all cap the word. One. And then he went on to explain, all is oneness despite the appearance of things. And if you could understand that everyone that you're looking at in this office, you are a part of that whole. And a spirit, a ghost, is a part of a whole that you're a part of. It's very hard for a three-dimensional personality and mind to grasp it. But if you can get close to that, suddenly the paradigm changes dramatically, and you really get to a new level of enlightenment and oneness and participative energy in a collective consciousness. But it's a hard reality, but he felt that was the first lesson, was to start moving away from manyness, duality, illusions of that nature, and try to grasp this. And it's very difficult when you're deep down in three-dimensional reality, in relationships with other people that aren't what you would say are ideal, to then grasp that you're just part of an entire collective with them. The morning stars are all one, and there you are and they are, and there's a oneness, and you lose your ego sense. Now, he did go on to say you have to come to know yourself to be your true self, yet one with the whole, with all the people here, everything you're seeing, and even ghosts and spirits and thought forms and everything. And he also encouraged deep meditation was the way you could actually get to that awareness. And he used the word deep over and over and tried to encourage deep meditation. You would hit that. Now, I've been teaching meditation for over 40 years to people, and I can tell you, even rank beginners, when you come out of a meditation and say, well, what did you feel? Many times they say, well, I sort of felt a part of everything and everything a part of me. So they were reaching at least the fringes of a greater truth, which is a hard truth for an individualized, separate being in a body all by itself over here to perceive to be the truths. But he wanted that to be the first lesson.
Laura? Lifetime sequential, or can we cherry pick time frames to be correct?
You know, we live in the earth plane, and it's very linear. I think that's a gift we're given, because it is hard to, it makes it a little bit easier to think of it in terms of 1, 2, 3. And so I've always been comforted to know that even Edgar Cayce could have a life where he abused his abilities. He was not only a womanizer, but he used his psychic ability to attract women, and also to read cards, which he was told that was part of the reason why he could not hear his own readings and had to have them written down so that he could come out of the trance and know what the heck he had said. So he kind of got a little bit of a downward trend there. And to me, that feels very natural with what I've seen in my own life, and John sort of addressed it. You make progress and you really try to work on something, and then it does seem like you shift back. You kind of go back and forth. And that's what I see with these ancient civilizations too. That's the thing that just flies all over me when I hear people assume that what we have right now is the pinnacle, and that this is the highest civilization that's ever been. And of course, in Casey's story, it's not. And that civilizations go up and down, things change, and things are destroyed and then recreated. And of course, we see that with energy and matter. Things have to be destroyed and then rebuilt, and destroyed and rebuilt. So it doesn't bother me that Edgar Casey had a bad life somewhere in there. It actually encourages me. But a little bit further with what you're thinking, there are times in my life, though, when I wonder if each individual life is sort of reliving the trajectory of all their past lives. There are times in my life when I think, I wonder if this is the time when I was the nun back in such and such a time, or was this the time that maybe I was a son of Belial back whenever. And because you can tell there are different phases in your life, different things that you go through. So maybe we actually get tested through the span of our life with all those challenges that we faced all along the way. That's kind of a mind-blowing thing. That's almost a oneness thing.
Can I add a closing thing? You know, the reading ended by saying that Edgar saved the entire life because he saw one of the dance hall girls still in the river while he and the others were on the raft escaping the Indian attack. And he slipped into the river and pulled her up onto his place on the raft. And the reading said, you healed that entire life with that one act.
Also, and correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't there a situation when he was dying his brain bridge that he was wounded and the pain was so excruciating that he developed the ability to travel out of his body, which assisted him as Edgar Casey?
No, actually, that was the lifetime as Yult. And that's where he developed his ability to become a sleeping prophet. He was half dead, half awake, and he was moving out of the body. The body was so badly wounded it wasn't going to recover, but he was moving between the two, and he got the skill and the feeling of how that worked, and that helped him do readings in this life, and he got nicknamed the Sleeping Prophet.
John, are lifetimes linear, or can we shift in time?
Well, in my next life, I'm going to be Nostradamus, and he's going to look like me. No. My understanding as a meditator since 1980, over 4 decades or so, is, and I always try to, as best I can to, when I deal with anything, is to have some experience of what I'm saying so that it could have as much authenticity as I can share with you. And I would say that time and mind seem to be an element necessary to create that idiocy of separation illusion. And so I know that Nostradamus in his prophecies and in his commentaries about them often talked about the 7 levels of perception of prophecy, and in his tortured, dyslexic, 1-page length sentences with no paragraphs, he would say something that sounded like the divine Godhead's 7th level was basically a continuum, where an ever-now state, and where all the past, present, and future were happening at once. Sort of, I call it kind of the temporal Costco. You're walking, and here are all of these future and past potentials for sale. And if you grab one off the shelf, you own it in the tax of time mind. So the problem with this situation, though, is with so many people talking about how doing more and more lives is creating, in a linear sense, a more evolved person to the point where people can then reach a point where they can get off the wheel of birth and life. That is actually an illusion then, if actually it's a continuum. So it could also be possible that every time we try to achieve more and more powers, more and more understandings, when we go 2 steps forward, 1 step back, it could be that we're doing that for eternities of millions of lives until we understand that time and mind is the problem, because it creates identity. And as much as you become a saint, or as much as you fall down as a sinner, you're really just playing the game of samsara, the wheel of life and death, life and death, life and death. You know, if you can go into your past lives, you'll probably find out that you have done 10 times over all the things that you've always dreamed to do. You've been the adept. You won the girl. You got the guy. You had the money. And I would also say that if you go into your past lives, you've done probably as many things that Adolf Hitler did. You've also been the dark and these things. But if this continuum issue is the way it is, then those people who meditate, especially like the Zen mystics, who basically say that there's really nothing to attain, that there's really simply an understanding that you are the eternal witness of this big movie called the Wheel of Life and Birth, the wheel of 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. And then at a certain point, when you step back deep enough and relax, it's not an attainment. They talk about it as a let go. The very opposite of this very Western mystical, you've got to do this and pull women out of the water and then erase a whole life. But if time is not involved, because that's a time sequence, if time is actually an illusion, then maybe those mystics, especially the mystics of Zen who talk about this, when enlightenment really happens, the mind and time disappear. And a whole different, ecstatic, eternal now is not created, but rediscovered.
Thank you. William?
So a couple of thoughts. First, it's a basic Gnostic tenet that we all have 2 existences. We have our divine self that remains in the celestial or heavenly realm, and the divine spark that comes down here and manifests one of these physical bodies to entertain ourselves, work out karma, whatever. There's nothing that says there can't be more than one divine spark existing simultaneously on this planet and another star system or anywhere throughout the cosmos. So that's a possibility. Quantum entanglement would then argue that all the divine sparks that are part of you are simultaneously in communication with other simultaneous existences. So that's a very good possibility. A little more down to earth. Previous life, back in the 80s, I was doing hypnosis work and learned to do something we call the parts party. People would want to solve a personal problem, quit smoking, stage fright, whatever it is. And you would go into a room and you would invite in various aspects of yourself. And the thought is that we all have different parts of ourselves that are responsible for different aspects of our life. The William that's participating in this event is not the same William that will go to sleep with Claire tonight or wake up in the morning and get up and do my work. I take off one hat, one mask, put on another. Well, in a parts party, these can manifest as person, places, or even objects. And very often in parts parties, they are individuals from different times and space and places. And the question always is, are these past lives that are currently influencing my present existence? Have I carried over habits from a past life, and am I in communication with this aspect of myself that is causing me to behave in this certain way? So maybe Edgar had this aspect of himself, this Bainbridge character who was a bit of a rogue, who was operating at the same time that Edgar was living in the 20th century. This is all possible in the context of this parts party aspect that I'm talking about. So I think, yeah, we have these multiple existences that we can tap into at any time, and they are happening concurrently because ultimately there is no such thing as time.
Interesting. Now, what I'd like to do, I'm going to ask one more question, but I'd like some of you, if you have questions, to begin to line up here. So go ahead and start lining up. I'm going to ask one more question and direct your question to a specific person. So the question I want to ask next, while you're lining up with your questions, and go ahead and begin, is William's been involved in some tremendous television programs, and I've been wanting to ask about this. What do you think's at Oak Island?
Well, gee, let me think. Well, let me put it this way. When the producers of Oak Island pitched that show to Nat Geo, that was their question. They said, well, what is the treasure? And the producer said, well, we don't know. And that's the beauty of the show. And Nat Geo said, well, we're not going to produce the show unless we know what the treasure is in advance. And the producer's like, well, can't you see that's the beauty? We might not ever find the treasure. They have found coins, they have found artifacts, so they're definitely onto something there. And I actually appeared on, I can't remember the name of it, it's Oak Island, Digging Deeper. And they flew me up to New York to talk with the Longino brothers. And I sat down, I kind of threw a wrinkle into it because I said, you know, guys, this Oak Island repository, you ever heard of Dr. James Hurtak, J.J. Hurtak? In the 70s, he wrote a book called The Keys of Enoch. He tells the story. He's a bona fide rocket scientist. Enoch, the pre-flood figure, prophet, first guy to walk with God, came and gets Dr. Hurtak, takes him into the stars in a ship. Hurtak comes back and writes this encyclopedic book that is almost impenetrable for humans to read. It's so scientific, so out there. But anyway, there's a map in this book. And in it, Enoch tells Hurtak there are 12 sacred sites that ring the planet like a pearl necklace of sacred sites. Off the top of my head, the Giza Plateau is the centerpiece of it. The middle of the Atlantic, where they presumed Atlantis was located. There's one in the Philippines. There's one in Lourdes, southern France. There's one in China. You wrap around. There's one in Hawaii. There's one in Vancouver, British Columbia. Oak Island, Nova Scotia.
Really?
Yes, and presumably Enoch is delivering this information from a pre-flood context, saying this is where these repositories were placed by this pre-flood civilization. Enoch told him there's two that will become, quote unquote, hot at the time of this great shift and transition, which Hurtak presumes is our time. Sedona and Nashville, Tennessee. And so the producers were like, oh, there's 12 of these things? You know, there's not just Oak Island, and so it sort of threw a kink into their whole plan here that they've got the only one. But I said, no, guys, you might want to expand your search. There could be a network of these places, and while you're trying to dig into Oak Island as the only one, you really ought to pull back and consider the entire network and how it might all work together. Because I think the mastermind that designed Oak Island did so from an extraplanetary perspective, knowing that there are these other repositories. So they've yet to come to Nashville. I've invited them. We've got some powerful two healing temples in Nashville, the Parthenon, and a copy of Mount Meru, the Cosmic Axis, is also built in Nashville. So Nashville's got some really interesting mysteries. So we'll talk about that another time. But anyway, that's the answer.
We hit 325. All right, give yourselves another round of applause. Ram Gatal, Dr. Gokal.
Well, I just want to thank the panelists and all the speakers and Ty for this wonderful gathering. It's been, in many ways, an awakening for me, certainly. And, you know, these things come in different ways. My comment and maybe a question relates to prophecies. And whilst prophecies are important and maybe a guide, there is a danger that you may get into a prophecy and really believe it and then falsely think, 2038, no disrespect to you, John, but 2038, and now we're in the sixth phase and the seventh one, it's all going to be hanky-dory. And if you can just live to 2038, the Almighty will put the switch on and voila, it's all over. So you forget that you're on a journey. And from the Vedic and the Hindu perspective, and I think John would relate to this, both the John, is that one has to do it oneself. Whilst we are all one and connected, we as individuals have to do it. And you have to go deep in, search, and find what is the truth for you, but the truth is universal. In the Vedas it says, truth is something that is unchanging. And to me, some of the talks and lectures, John, have intimated that. And rather than speak of prophecies, which are important, the emphasis for individuals has to be, what is the journey? How do I really go deep within myself to find myself? And I was speaking to William Henry last night, and we were saying, the rainbow is not there, although it's beautiful to see the rainbow, but the rainbow is here, right here. And to awaken oneself, one has to recognize the rainbow and the beauty within ourselves. You know, I'm a physician, and the heart is a phenomenal organ, but not in a physical sense. In Sanskrit, it's called the Hirdaya. Hirdaya means that center which is beyond everything. We have everything that we need to move ourselves away from this 3D duality into a state where we can be there or within ourselves, and also to be able to live in this 3D without the attachment and without all these lower emotions. We live here in these lower 3 chakras, and we need to move beyond to expand to things. So
Thank you.
The question, I don't know who to, is there could be a conflict between prophecy and your inner journey. And I think one has to be cognizant of that movement, of that journey, of who you really are. I mean, that's the basic question of who you are, what the journey is, and we all know what the answer is. It's how to manifest that answer. And the Vedas say it's the freebies that I have arranged for you. And what are these freebies? It's meditation, breathing, grounding, and the philosophy and the principles of yoga, which if you are able to entrain within yourself in a disciplined way, persistence, you can achieve it. And the Gita, and Lord Krishna says, only a few perchance achieve that goal. It's a difficult, mighty journey. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we go to a question, can I at least say, I live and walk in that paradox. I mean, that is the truth. This is a paradox. I cannot delineate it for you or explain it. The infinite oneness is also in the multiplicity and the sequence. It's a friggin' paradox that I have to live in.
Please.
I want to offer gratitude for the beautiful harmony and coherence that we all have created here together, and thank you for putting this on. So my question goes to Nostradamus, and I would like to...
Which one?
I would like to offer the perspective that many of us have come from the future, and we can reincarnate in the past. We can reincarnate in the future far distant from what might look like our next lifetime. Yes, you're the one. Just
Yeah.
the honoring that many of us have come from the future,
Right.
and to break the whole linear
Oh, I
paradigm.
see. So so coming out. Yeah, great.
Well, I would just pose an interesting caveat to that. When we look at so many people talking about other lives they've lived, the vast, vast majority of us are not equally talking about future lives we will live. So it's possible that, you know, if this is the pool of people, and Raymond Moody and others who have done so much to document, and certainly in the East, where there's not as much of a social cultural bias to talk about this. There are many thousands of documented reports of people talking about other lives they've lived. But in all the 30, 40 years I've been doing this, the vast majority of the lives seen are lives in the past. So it's just an interesting thing that gets that pauses to reflect on that idea.
Well, I'm just offering it so we can break free and open that possibility of.
Well,
coming back
I
to
agree with the
future.
doctor that you have to first find out who is the one that needs freedom breaking.
Well, we're all eternal is the bottom line.
Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, gratitude to all of you for the fabulous, heartfelt information shared with everyone. My question is, the prophecy is that we're to be moving towards at least 12-stranded DNA. And so I guess I'm addressing this to you, Dr. Lindell, since you're the next one in line. Is that correct? If not, it can be someone else. So my question is this. Right now, they say that most of our DNA is junk DNA, right? That only a tiny portion is recognized as having any significance. Could it be that the 12 strands of our DNA and that colloidal time in which we all live, meaning our past lives and our future are all as one in that great oneness, is already within our DNA, and it's the template that we will go forward with that travels with us in that sacred torus that generates us? Is that possibly the explanation? That's our template, the 12-strand DNA for the oneness.
Okay. Wow, what a question. But you actually touched on something that I believe. I believe that the physical evidence for our past lives and who we are is in our DNA. I believe that's where it's located, and which portions of our DNA that we get from the people who came before us. And oftentimes, Casey said, we were in a soul group that continues to come back together. So chances are some of my DNA is from some of my lifetimes, but not totally. And you choose which ones to activate. Some things get activated, some things don't. Some things get manifested, some don't. And I think everything in the spiritual world has a physical manifestation, and I vote for DNA as our record that moves forward with all the choices that we make that create our soul.
Thank you. Phil?
So my question, I guess, will direct to John Hogue, though it was kind of generated by the other John here. So Thoth tells us that all paradoxes must be resolved. So what would be your opinion on how we resolve this issue that John brought up? You know, that we have to be one and an individual yet, too. So I'll leave it to you.
Well, hello. Well, as a meditator, I sometimes just watch that question and says, who says we have to resolve it, and who will resolve it? Is this the mind trying to transcend the mind? And then what I found is that when I simply just let all of these things be there for witnessing, without a judgment for or against, there's a certain totality of witnessing that makes much of this simply evaporate like an illusion. And then an inward process happens that somehow, well, it gets very difficult to put it into words, but it is ecstatic in the true sense of that word. It is out of this, but also in this. It's like all the identities disappear. There are not pine trees and deciduous trees. There's no trees, but everything is there without an identity. And it has a glimpse of incredible ecstasy and bliss to it. And so my view is not of attaining. My view is relaxing. My view and experience is let go. So I trust in that. because it seems that the more we relax deep into our center, the more we don't have to practice morality, we are morality. We don't have to attain intelligence. Intelligence is effortless, and so is love.
Again, gratitude for all that you do, every one of you. So I have a question about Mother Earth, and we're talking a lot about our own personal awakening, but also we live in this wonderful place. And where do you see the awakening or the paradigm shift of Mother Earth connected to the greater cosmos?
Well, you can go back to James Lovelock. He doesn't have a very nice view of it, though. He's the one who coined the term Gaia hypothesis. He was another NASA rocket scientist working on Mars projects and came up with the idea that Earth was a conscious entity based on more ancient ideas. And he's now 97 years old. He gives interviews all the time. And he said, Mother Earth is definitely speaking to us. The Gaia consciousness is speaking to us. In fact, Gaia is responsible for the growth of artificial intelligence, that Gaia has created artificial intelligence in order to eliminate humanity from the surface of the planet. And he believes this will happen within the next 2 decades. And so, as I say, it's not a very nice view, but this is the man who brought forward this idea, this very new age ideal that Earth is our mother and Earth and the Gaia hypothesis, and this is what he's getting. And so what, the ultimate message there is hey, it's time to wake up, that, maybe there's some issues that humanity really wants to very quickly address, get in touch with the mother and say, hey, maybe we can make some better choices than we've been making.
One thing I'd like to add, I think that a lot of the global changes that we see that are taking place on the earth are viewed from the other side much differently. Isn't it interesting how global disasters bring out the best in humanity? Isn't that a paradox? Thank you.
Hey, James, can I tell a quick little story of Eula Allen was one of the first people with Edgar Cayce, and she was one of these very wise Earth mothers. And I was about 19 years old, and we used to go over to her house and sit around in a circle like a bunch of little students to be in the presence of this wise woman. And one day we were sitting there, and a pounding on the front door came, a fierce pounding. She opened it, and black-suited men came in with a search warrant and said, we have the right to search your whole property to see what you're doing in here that keeps blowing the transformer out on the electrical lines. And Eula said, oh, honey, come on, I'll show you what I do. She takes these guys out to the backyard, and there are 2 worn paths of feet where her feet have been. She stands there and she goes, now what I'm going to do is connect the earth to the heavens, and it'll blow your transformer. And she stands like this, bam, and these guys say, okay, never mind, and they leave. Next week, Virginia Power comes with a big truck and moves the transformer 2 blocks down the...
So these will be the last 3 questions, and then when we end, I'm going to ask a brief commentary from the 4 that are on stage.
Okay, this is an ascension question for whoever wishes to answer it. The question is, do we need to complete our karma and that of our ancestors in order to ascend and stay in the ascended state?
Thank you.
Well, Edgar told 15 people this would be their last incarnation, and I knew 4 of them, and they were not perfect. So obviously this dimension is not where you can finish everything. Some people can work on it somewhere else.
I'm not sure who asked this, but you mentioned that our past lives are a part of our DNA, and we know our children are part of our DNA. So how does that relate our past lives? Do we pass that down to our children? Or is that a blend? Or help me out.
Science has 14 generations now, transgenerational transmission of habits and behaviors. They've shown it, demonstrated science through our DNA.
So our past 14 of our past lives are passed
Influencing
down.
your thoughts and behaviors subconsciously.
And so it's a husband and wife, so do they get 28?
Some marriages are like
It gets worse as you go along, you know.
I can say one more thing. I think it also goes back to what Casey's idea of soul groups, that we come together as a group and we do influence each other. And so the DNA is just reflecting what's already been happening, and we're doing this together. We think we're in this alone. We do have to make choices on our own, but we really do support each other. There are groups of people who are here with you because they love you, and there are people you're with that sometimes drive you crazy, but you love them, and that's why they're in your life. And so that's the ongoing thing as well. We really are in oneness, even though it feels like we're separate.
Thank you. Last question.
Hi, my question is to Mr. William Henry. I know we're speaking about transhumanism and AI, but my question is more, what are your thoughts on how the finance system is moving into a cashless society, and this whole topic about cryptocurrency and the implications of it?
Well, I'm not an expert on the cryptocurrencies, but whenever you're talking about cashless society, it brings up the idea of the mark of the beast, where you won't be able to buy, sell, or trade unless you've got this mark. And this is seemingly for the first time, maybe in history, that we have the technology where we can make that a reality for everybody, that you can't go into a store and buy something unless you have this mark. Any of you been chipped out here? Okay. Anybody carrying a debit card? Okay. So, yeah, you've been chipped. You've got the mark of the beast. You know, go to the grocery store, put your chip in here. Put your chip in, insert your chip in and right now you're doing it with a debit card, piece of plastic, but that is you, for all intents and purposes. And the other dynamic of that's in play as well is that it's not only your physical self that is negotiating with the store when you give them your chip, it's your data self too, what the banks now call your data self. You every time you're online, anytime you're using your debit card, you're negotiating with governments, with corporations, and they call that your data self, that knows more about you than maybe your physical self. So we all are living in now this world where we have our physical selves, but we also have this other aspect of ourselves that is operating in this wonderful land we call the internet. And what will next happen is that data self they will more and more encourage you to create an avatar or cartoon version of yourself that will be interacting with other cartoon versions of your friends and loved ones on Facebook and so forth. They call it Facebook Spaces, but everywhere you go, you're more and more going to be dealing less with your physical self and more with your avatar data self. And so this is this whole, pardon me? Use cash. Yeah, well, they're going to try to eliminate cash. That's part of this whole movement. So go ahead, John.
Yeah, I'd like to. Hello.
You want to chip in here?
I'd like to. Well, yes, I would, little fella. Pilgrim. Okay. Well, I actually do a lot of commentary and writing about cryptocurrency. I started writing essays about it back in 2012, 2013, when it was just beginning. And in a way, cryptocurrency is being assailed by the establishment of the chip beast because it's trying to create a person-on-person, private, encrypted, person-on-person, anywhere in the world system of transaction that would wipe out the banks, that would wipe out the need eventually for borders, that would actually be, in an odd way, this commerce of individuals would be a way to bring a global world into the world that Casey and others have been foreseeing. And that is why you will not hear a lot of very positive things about it in the corporate-owned media that the banks run. Now, it is in its Wild West phase, And it eventually will have to find a certain kind of way to kind of play something similar to the chip, but this time it's individual empowerment. It's the 777, not the 666.
I'm for the 888.
999.
Laura, John, you have a comment?
No.
Final comments or no?
The message is always the same. You know, it's about our choices, and the choice is always love or fear. And if we put more love into the world, Golden Rule says that's what we're going to get back. And we all have to be very mindful of, minding that fear. Be careful of how we're navigating this world. Pay attention. But ultimately, it comes back to our individual choices and individual actions at all times. John and I used to talk about the King of Terror back in 1999. And maybe there was a King of Terror that did come out of the sky in 1999 or 2001. But maybe that's also an archetype within all of us, that we all have these aspects of it within ourselves. And we're capable of wreaking havoc in our lives by not having enough information or making poor choices. So my advice is at all times, there's always that prophecy of the choices that we're going to make. And please choose love over fear.
There was a comment earlier by the doctor who was talking about prophecy and how prophecy can be self-fulfilling. And it's a very good point to make, because and especially as a scholar of Nostradamus, he is probably the most significant prophet that has objectively shown to us that the dogma that so many religions hold, that everything is preordained, is actually not true. There are many, many prophecies in his prophecies that look like they were going a certain way, and then things that went another way. And there's also the famous story that made him famous to this day. He wrote a prophecy about the King of France dying in a jousting accident in 1555. He wrote it. It happened in 1557. But it was such the talk of the French court that he was summoned to the court from Provence to explain himself to the King and Queen Catherine de' Medici. And what he did, we don't know what he said, but we know what they were reading, the first 3 volumes that were serialized of his Les Prophéties, the prophecies, his history of the future. And in that, he has 2 alternative futures for Henry II. One is a very detailed century 1, quatrain 35, the famous jousting accident that killed the king and started the civil wars of religion in France that Nostradamus was trying to prevent. He was the other thing is there are at least a half a dozen prophecies that describe Henry II as a second Charlemagne, that if he didn't die in the jousting accidents, although that wasn't inferred, but if he lived on, he would actually have conquered northern Italy and Savoy and bring that all into the French kingdom and avoid Catholic and Protestant French people fighting these terrible 9 civil wars of religion. Now the king, we do know this, that the king, when he left the audience, talked to friends, musing that, well, I think it wouldn't be a bad thing if my fate were to die at the hands of a noble in ritual combat. In so many words, he basically had made a decision, and his decision was to get killed. And he did 4 years later, and all the things that set in motion the famous prophecies, that thread of prophecies through the 1,000 or so plus prophecies, has brought us to this day and me talking to you. So there is free choice, and your futures, he used to say, can be inclined. He wanted these prophecies to help you incline the futures towards a better time, a better future. And we can do that.
I also wanted to comment something else, Dr. Ram, right? I said that the rainbow is within. And I always like to remind people there's 3 parts to a rainbow. The sun, right? The water, and what's the third part?
The witness.
The witness, the person that sees it, right? The witness. Very good. Thank you, John. Thank you for reminding us about that.
And I'll just reinforce what John said. The Casey readings are very clear that the future's not set, that we can change the future with our actions through our choices and our decisions. And I think that's real important for us to remember, that we do have control and not to lose hope when it looks like things aren't going well. And he also makes plain, as do a lot of other wisdom traditions, that it really starts with you. Be the change that you want to see out there. And that's the thing we have the most control over is ourselves. And I can't tell you how many times I've had to relearn that lesson, that if I want to receive love, I have to be loving. If I want to have friends, I have to be friendly. And it's amazing how much people will pick up on your energy, on what you do, and you'll find that your own environment can change just by making changes in yourself. And it really is simple, but yet it's hard to do. And the reason that the Casey readings go into about that it's hard is because of our will. We have free will, but oftentimes it's asleep. We're so often on automatic. We just react to things. We grew up with a certain kind of pattern, and we continue that pattern over time. It's hard to become conscious. It's scary to become conscious. It's hurtful sometimes to become conscious, especially when you're learning things about yourself that you might not want to see. So there's a real tendency within us to kind of go to sleep and not actually pay attention to what's going on around us. So I think consciousness, making as good a choice as we can in any particular time, and trying to be the change that in any moment that we are wanting to see in others.
Thank you. I'd like to ask everyone that was a speaker or a healer or a volunteer that helped put together this conference to stand up, please.
Dedicated to all spiritual activists, truth seekers, and peaceful warriors worldwide.
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace.
Once upon a time, not long ago, there was a boy who would grow and become a great soul. He lived in India and his name was Gandhi. He believed in human rights and he fought for equality. He felt so strongly that he trained himself, cause he realized first he'd have to change himself. He changed his clothes and decided to walk. Some days he practiced silence and refused to talk. When he was young, he studied to be a lawyer, and then he became a great spiritual warrior. He read from the scriptures of every religion, came to the realization that we're all God's children. Because he understood that we're all equal, he became a spokesman for the people, a karma yogi devoted to service. To spread truth and peace was his purpose. You gotta be the change that you wanna see in the world. Be the change, just like Gandhi. Be the change that you wanna see in the world, just like Gandhi. Gandhi dedicated his life to the cause, even when it meant breaking unjust laws. He often faced prison and incarceration, but that only strengthened his determination. He said he would make every sacrifice, but that he would never kill or take a life. He used his heart instead of his fist, and he taught non-violence as the way to resist. A peaceful soldier who used his mind to fight for the rights of humankind, but not just people, animals too. In his basic teaching, God is truth. He joined Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus, Christians, Buddhists, Jains, and Jews. All the many paths that lead into the light that shines bright inside of me and you. You gotta be the change that you wanna see in the world. Be the change, just like Gandhi. Be the change that you wanna see in the world, just like Gandhi. Be the change that you wanna see in the world. Be the change, just like Gandhi. Be the change that you wanna see in the world, just like Gandhi taught an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, and it takes more strength and faith to be kind. With that in mind, Gandhi took a stand against the foreign occupation of his land. When things got violent, Gandhi would fast, not eating for days until the riots would pass. But the biggest event that made the British halt is when Gandhi G decided to harvest salt. The British Empire installed a salt tax, and stealing salt was an unlawful act. So Gandhi and his peeps took to the streets, 10,000 deep, they marched to the beach. But when they arrived, they were beaten with clubs, but they didn't fight back, instead they chose love. The foreign military realized they were wrong and eventually decided to go back home. You see, Gandhi G was a very great leader, but before all that, he was shy and meager. As a young child, he was just like you and me before he became Mahatma Gandhi. The word Mahatma, it means great soul, and it's inside of us just waiting to unfold. If you follow your heart and act real bold, next time it'll be your story that's told. You gotta be the change that you wanna see in the world. Be the change, just like Gandhi. Be the change that you wanna see in the world, just like Gandhi. Be the change that you wanna see in the world. Be the change, just like Gandhi. Be the change that you wanna see in the world, just like Gandhi. Be the change that you wanna see in the world. Be the change, just like Gandhi. Be the change that you wanna see in the world, just like Gandhi. Be the change that you wanna see in the world. Be the change, just like Gandhi. Be the change that you wanna see in the world, just like Gandhi.
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace.
Well, I dreamed I saw the knights in armor coming, saying something about a queen. There were peasants singing and drummers drumming, and the archers split the tree. There was a fanfare blowing to the sun, there was floating on the breeze. Look at Mother Nature on the run in the 20th century. Look at Mother Nature on the run in the 20th century. I was lying in a burned out basement with the full moon in my eyes. I was hoping for replacement when the sun burst through the sky. There was a band playing in my head, and I felt like I could cry. I was thinking about what a friend had said. I was hoping it was a lie. Thinking about what a friend had said, I was hoping it was a lie. Spaceships flying in the yellow haze of the sun. There were children crying and colors flying all around the chosen ones. All in a dream, all in a dream. The loading had begun. Flying Mother Nature's silver seed